The suitcase wheels clattered across the hardwood floor like gunfire in the silence of the house. Vanessa Brooks yanked the handle upward, checked her reflection in the hallway mirror, and didn't even glance at the man standing by the kitchen counter. I'm choosing someone who actually has a future, she said, her voice flat and final, like she'd rehearsed it in the car on the way home. Malcolm Brooks didn't move. He stood there in his faded work boots, a coffee mug cooling in his hand, watching 11 years of marriage roll toward the front door on two suitcase wheels. Does he know everything? Malcolm asked quietly. Vanessa laughed. It wasn't a kind laugh. What is there to know? She didn't wait for an answer. She grabbed her keys, pulled the door open, and stepped into the evening air like she was stepping into a better life. Malcolm stood alone in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound left in the house. He set his mug down slowly. Then, almost to himself, he whispered the same question again, the one she never bothered to answer. Did you ever ask what my family actually owns? The door had already closed. She was already gone. 24 hours earlier, none of this seemed possible. The alarm went off at 4:45 a.m., the same time it had for the last 20 years. Malcolm rolled out of bed without complaint, made black coffee in a chipped mug, and pulled on the same worn boots he wore to every job site. His pickup truck coughed twice before the engine caught, and he drove through empty streets while the rest of Rivergate City was still asleep. He liked it that way. No traffic, no noise, just concrete, steel, and the quiet satisfaction of watching a building rise exactly the way it was supposed to. By the time the sun came up, Malcolm was already on site, walking the perimeter of a half-finished commercial tower with a set of blueprints tucked under his arm. A young foreman jogged over, panic written across his face. Mr. Brooks, we've got a problem with the load-bearing columns on the 3rd floor. The specs don't match what the crew poured. Malcolm didn't raise his voice. He never did. He walked the site, ran his hand along the rebar, checked the numbers twice, and made a single call that saved the project 2 weeks and nearly $500,000 in rework. The crew watched him the way soldiers watch a commander who's never lost a battle. Quiet respect, no questions asked. To every person on that site, Malcolm Brooks was simply a brilliant engineer. Steady, humble, reliable. Nobody there knew what waited for him at home, and nobody there knew what waited for him in a locked cabinet in his late father's study. That evening, dinner was quiet in the way dinners get quiet right before something breaks. Vanessa talked about a luxury condo development downtown, the kind with rooftop pools and private elevators. She talked about the men she'd met at a networking event the week before. Developers, investors, men who wore tailored suits and talked about vision and scale. Robert closed a $14 million deal last month, she said, swirling her wine. 14 million, Malcolm. Do you know what that kind of ambition looks like? Malcolm chewed his food slowly. I know what a building looks like when it's built right, he said. That's usually worth more than the deal that put it up. Vanessa rolled her eyes. She'd heard this before. The safe answer. The quiet answer. The answer of a man who checked concrete for a living while other men chased empires. She didn't know that the concrete he checked belonged to buildings his own family had financed. The marriage had been dying for over a year, and both of them knew it, even if only one of them was honest about it. Vanessa had convinced herself she deserved more. More excitement, more status, more proof that the man beside her was going somewhere. She'd stopped noticing that Malcolm never needed to prove anything to anyone, mistaking his silence for emptiness instead of what it actually was. 3 weeks later, she met Ethan Cross. Ethan was everything Malcolm wasn't on the surface: loud, magnetic, dressed in a way that made every room notice him the second he walked in. He talked about luxury towers and international investors and a skyline that would carry his name for generations. Vanessa was intoxicated by the noise of it all. What she didn't know, what almost no one knew yet, was that Ethan Cross was drowning. Behind the tailored suits and the confident smile was a mountain of debt, a string of stalled projects, and investors who were starting to ask questions he couldn't answer. But charisma is a powerful disguise, and Vanessa saw only the surface. The night she left, she didn't cry. She didn't hesitate. She stood in the doorway of the house she'd shared with Malcolm for over a decade and told him the truth as she saw it. "I'm choosing someone who actually has a future." And Malcolm, standing there with a mug of cooling coffee, asked her one final question before she disappeared into a life she thought was an upgrade. "Did you ever wonder why my father never sold any of his land?" Vanessa blinked. She genuinely didn't understand the question. In 11 years of marriage, she had never once asked about Malcolm's father's estate, never once wondered why a modest, hardworking family seemed to own the ground certain buildings sat on, never once cared enough to look past the work boots and the pickup truck. "What land?" she asked, more out of irritation than curiosity. Malcolm just shook his head slightly. "Never mind. Drive safe." She left. The door clicked shut, and for the first time in years, Malcolm exhaled like a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying quietly for far too long. He didn't call anyone. He didn't cry. He didn't chase after her car as it pulled out of the driveway. Instead, he walked down the hallway to a room he rarely entered. His late father's study, untouched since the funeral 3 years earlier, the air inside still carrying the faint smell of old paper and cedar. In the corner sat a heavy oak cabinet, locked with a key Malcolm had kept on his ring since the day his father died, though he'd never once turned it. Tonight he turned it. Inside were folders organized with military precision, property maps stretching across 3 counties, trust agreements dated back over 30 years, corporate ownership records tied to a holding company Malcolm's grandfather had quietly built and his father had spent a lifetime protecting. Malcolm sat at the old desk and read through documents he'd only skimmed once before, at his father's insistence years ago. The numbers were staggering. A family holding company worth more than $45 million. Land beneath half the commercial developments in Rivergate City. Buildings that had gone up in the last decade, all standing on ground that ultimately answered to the Brooks family trust. None of it had ever been marital property. His father had structured it that way on purpose, decades before Malcolm even met Vanessa, with a foresight that now felt almost like protection from beyond the grave. Malcolm closed the folder and sat in the silence of the study for a long time. He wasn't angry. He wasn't plotting revenge. He was simply a man finally standing at the edge of a truth his father had prepared him to carry quietly. Vanessa, meanwhile, was already unpacking her bags in Ethan's penthouse, feeling for the first time in years like she'd finally escaped a life that was too small for her. The city lights stretched out below the floor-to-ceiling windows, and she told herself this was what ambition looked like. This was what she deserved. She had no idea how fragile the ground beneath that penthouse truly was. The next morning, Malcolm drove to his mother's house instead of the job site. Gloria Brooks opened the door before he even knocked, the way mothers sometimes do when they already know their child is carrying something heavy. "She's gone," Malcolm said simply, sitting down at the kitchen table where he'd eaten breakfast 1,000 times as a boy. Gloria poured him coffee without a word, then finally sat across from him. "She never wanted to know the man behind the work boots," she said. "She wanted the story before she wanted the man." Malcolm turned the mug slowly in his hands. "I asked her about the land. She didn't even know what I meant." Gloria nodded, unsurprised. "Your father always said the right person doesn't need to be told what you're worth. They already know, because they took the time to actually see you." Malcolm didn't respond right away. He thought about 11 years of quiet dinners, 11 years of being compared to louder, flashier men, 11 years of never once explaining himself because he never believed he needed to. "What do I do now?" he asked. "Exactly what you've always done," Gloria said. "Keep building. Just do it under your own name this time." That afternoon, Malcolm met with Daniel Hayes, the attorney who had managed the family trust since before Malcolm was born. Daniel's office was modest, tucked above a bookstore downtown, deliberately unremarkable for a man who quietly oversaw one of the largest private land portfolios in the state. "Your father built this to protect you," Daniel said, sliding a folder across the desk. "Not to punish anyone. Not for revenge." "I'm not interested in revenge," Malcolm said. "I want this handled quietly. No announcements. No interviews. Just protect what my family built." Daniel studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. There's something else you should know. He opened a second folder, this one filled with financial disclosures, investor prospectuses, and property listings. Ethan Cross, Daniel said. The man your wife left you for. Malcolm's expression didn't change, but he leaned forward slightly. He's been presenting investment proposals using land parcels downtown, Daniel continued. Parcels he doesn't actually control. Parcels that belong, in part, to your family's holding company. The room went quiet. And it gets worse, Daniel added. Some of his primary lenders are also investors in your family trust. If his numbers don't add up soon, it's not just his reputation on the line. It's every dollar tied to those projects. Malcolm sat back slowly, absorbing the weight of what he'd just heard. He wasn't scheming. He wasn't smiling with satisfaction. He simply understood, with the same calm clarity he brought to a construction site, that a serious structural flaw had just been discovered, and eventually someone would have to deal with it. Watch it, Malcolm said finally. Don't move yet. Just watch. Weeks passed. Vanessa settled into her new life, attending galas on Ethan's arm, posting photos from rooftop parties, convincing herself she'd made the right choice. But small cracks were beginning to show. Cracks she didn't yet know how to read. At a charity dinner, an older businessman named Marcus Ellis approached their table, shook Ethan's hand politely, and then turned to Vanessa with a curious expression. Weren't you married to Malcolm Brooks? He asked. I was, Vanessa said. A little too quickly, a little too proud. We're divorced now. Marcus tilted his head slightly. You do know who Malcolm Brooks actually is, don't you? Vanessa forced a laugh. He's an engineer. A good one, but that's one way to put it, Marcus said, a knowing smile crossing his face before he excused himself and walked away. Vanessa sat there for a moment, an uncomfortable feeling creeping into her chest. The first small crack in the confidence she'd been wearing like armor for weeks. The following month, Rivergate City hosted its annual Industry Leadership Summit, a gathering of the region's most powerful developers, bankers, and investors. Ethan insisted on attending to shore up confidence among his lenders, and Vanessa joined him, dressed in the kind of designer outfit she once believed was proof she'd made it. She wasn't prepared for what happened when they walked through the doors. Malcolm was already there, dressed simply, standing near the back of the room in a plain blazer that looked almost out of place among the tailored suits. But the moment people noticed him, the room shifted. A bank executive crossed the floor first, shaking Malcolm's hand warmly. Mr. Brooks, good to see you. We're still thrilled about the Riverside project. A developer approached next, thanking him for a land agreement that had apparently saved his company from bankruptcy 2 years earlier. Then another, and another. Vanessa stood frozen, watching person after person greet her ex-husband with a level of respect she'd never once seen directed at Ethan, despite all his noise and charisma. Wait, she said quietly to a woman standing nearby. You don't know who Malcolm Brooks really is? The woman looked at her like she'd asked the strangest question in the world. Half the buildings in this city sit on land his family controls. He's the quietest, powerful man in Rivergate. Everyone knows that. Vanessa felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her heels. 11 years of marriage, and she had never once known the truth standing right beside her every single night. Ethan, sensing the shift in the room, pulled Malcolm aside privately before the evening ended, his confident smile faltering slightly at the edges. Brooks, Ethan said, extending a hand. I didn't realize we'd already crossed paths in business circles. Malcolm shook his hand once, calmly. We haven't. Not yet. 2 days later, Malcolm requested a private meeting. Ethan arrived expecting a personal conversation, still under the impression this was about Vanessa, about pride, about a wounded ex-husband looking for closure. Instead, Malcolm slid a folder across the table. Ethan opened it slowly. Property deeds, ownership records, corporate filings. Every major parcel Ethan had used in his investor presentations, every promise he'd made to secure funding for his luxury towers, belonged, at least in part, to the Brooks family trust. The room went silent. You built presentations on land that was never yours, Malcolm said quietly, no anger in his voice, just fact after fact laid bare like blueprints on a table. Ethan's confident expression cracked for the first time. "This is a misunderstanding. We can restructure. We can." "You lied to your investors," Malcolm said, cutting him off gently but firmly. "That's not something I did to you. That's something you did to yourself." Malcolm stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out without another word. No threats, no raised voice, no satisfaction on his face. Just the calm certainty of a man who had simply revealed a truth that was always going to surface eventually. Within days, the banks began asking questions. Investors who once trusted Ethan's confident presentations started requesting documentation he couldn't produce. Financing on 2 major projects froze overnight. Contractors stopped showing up to job sites. News spread quickly through Rivergate's tight-knit business community, the way collapse always does, quietly at first, then all at once. Vanessa watched it happen from the penthouse she'd once believed was proof of a better life. The city lights outside suddenly feeling less like opportunity and more like exposure. Ethan's empire didn't collapse because Malcolm attacked it. It collapsed because it had never truly been built on solid ground to begin with. Malcolm had simply stopped holding the door closed on a truth that was always destined to come out. Months passed. Rivergate City moved on the way cities always do, construction cranes shifting from one skyline to another. But something new was rising on the east side of downtown, in a neighborhood that had been overlooked for years. Instead of luxury towers with private elevators and rooftop pools, Malcolm broke ground on something different. Affordable housing units, a public park, small business spaces designed for local families instead of outside investors. For the first time, he did it under his own name, the Brooks family finally stepping fully into public view after decades of quiet, careful work. The city began to understand who had shaped its future all along, one modest project at a time, without ever needing recognition for it. Vanessa watched from a distance, scrolling past a local news article about the development on her phone one evening. The penthouse she'd once shared with Ethan, now a memory tangled in unpaid debts and broken promises. She understood, far too late, that she hadn't left a man without a future. She'd left a man who never needed to announce his success to anyone, because he'd never once measured himself by anyone else's definition of importance. She typed a short message and sent it before she could talk herself out of it. "I hope life has been good to you." Malcolm read it standing on a half-finished sidewalk, his crew laying fresh concrete a few yards away, the late afternoon sun stretching long shadows across the site. He smiled faintly, not out of bitterness, not out of triumph, just the quiet acknowledgement of a chapter that had finally, fully closed. He locked his phone, slid it into his pocket, and turned back toward his crew, checking the concrete the way he always did, carefully, patiently, without needing anyone to notice. Some people chase wealth their entire lives just to feel important. Others become important long before anyone ever discovers they're wealthy. Malcolm Brooks never changed who he was, not for a single day of his life. The only thing that ever changed was who finally saw him clearly. If this story moved you, make sure to hit that like button, drop a comment telling us what part hit you the hardest, and subscribe for more stories like this one every single week. We've got so many more coming your way. Don't miss the next one.